Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim daf Samachay. This week's learning is sponsored by Yomi in honor of Rabbanit Michelle. Toda Rabba to Rabbanit Michelle and the entire Hadran community for your energy, hard work, ongoing commitment, and inspiration. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Farber on the fourth yahrzeit of Yuval Mor Yosef and Yossi Cohen, who were killed in a terror attack in Givat Asaf, and for the continued refuah shlema for son Netanel Ilan ben Shenet Zipporah, who was critically injured in the attack. Today's daf is also sponsored by Patty Evans on the second yahrzeit of her mother, Gloria Weissman. Mom's sparkle shines no less now than when she was with us. We feel her love and support all around as her memory is indeed a blessing. Okay, we're going to get started with a braita, which is really a tosefta. Our topic, if you remember, where we ended yesterday was Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis disagree about nolad. We're talking about petach, which is undoing a neder, dissolving it by, when you go to dissolve the neder, they suggest, had you known, blah, 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 would you have done this? So can you say, had you known something that, number one, wasn't in existence at the time of the vow, and number two, right, that's how we define nolad, also was something that was unlikely to occur, or it wasn't really expected at all. So Rabbi Eliezer says no problem. And the rabbis have a more stringent view on this hatarat nedarim and say, no, you can't really do that. So now we're going to talk about another element of hatarat nedarim, and then we're going to get back to the nolad issue, but from the next Mishna, we'll talk about a bit of a different variation on the nolad case. So we start with Tanya, which is a quote from the Tosefta. Hamudal hana'a mechavero ein mitzirin lo ela b'fanav. This is a law that we're going to learn about now, which is a bit confusing because there's a bunch of different versions of the text, there's different ways of understanding this. There's all sorts of different things here. And in fact, Gefet this week, which will be up in English at some point, hopefully later today, discusses, right now it's up in the Hebrew side, it discusses the issue of this entire topic that we're going to read from here till the Mishnah, and the many different ways of interpreting it. So it really delves much more in depth than we're going to get to do today. I'll just kind of touch it on the surface of some of the issues that come up. Someone who's mudar hana'a mechavero, I'm not allowed to benefit from you. Ein mitzirim lo ela b'fanav. If I'm going to undo that vow, I can only do it in your presence. So the first thing to know is that some people have the version that says mudar hana'a mechavero b'fanav. Only if I took the vow in front of you do I have to undo it in front of you in your presence, but not necessarily if I just made the vow. So that's the first thing that's already not clear. Is it any vow I make to forbid your property to me, let's say, or is it only a vow that I made in your presence? What if I didn't make the vow to you? What if I made the vow? You go with the one that if you did the vow in the presence of a person, maybe it's not only if I'm mudar na'ah, let's say, or mudar na'ah from you, let's say, I forbid myself to benefit from you, but I said it in front of two random people. Okay. Do I have to undo the vow in front of those people? Right. It depends on the version I have and on how we understand it. Now, in order to understand the different versions, we need to understand what the logic is behind this. So luckily, the Yerushalmi gives us a hint into this, because the Yerushalmi were more than a hint. The Yerushalmi brings two interpretations. Interesting, it doesn't appear in our sugya, why this is. One is mipnei habusha, and one is mipnei chashad. So let's explain both of those. Mipnei habusha is because of the humiliation. What humiliation? Well, that fits better. If we're talking about that I was prohibited to you specifically, I have to do it in your presence if I want to undo it. Why? Well, there's always a concern, and we've talked about this already, that I'll lie when I'm doing this petach, or I'll make up some silly petach, or the rabbis will suggest something and I'll say, oh yeah, sure, when I don't really mean it, in which case it won't really be. Now, or I'll try to come up with some very, unlikely reason just to get out of the vow. Now, if you're standing in front of me, then I'll be more embarrassed to do that. And it'll be less likely that I'll be able to come up with something ridiculous when you're there. So that's busha. Busha literally means, right, the shame, humiliation, embarrassment, something along those lines. More like embarrassment. I'll be embarrassed to do it in front of you. Mipnei chashad fits better with whoever I made the vow in front of, I need to undo it in front of them, because chashad is, if you know I took a vow, and how do you know? Because I did it in front of you. And then it could be you or anybody else. It could be that I took the vow against you or I took the vow against someone else, but you heard me say it. then if you see me benefiting from that person and you don't know that I dissolve the vow, then you'll suspect me. Chashad is suspicion. You'll start walking around saying, I can't believe Michelle goes against her vows. That's terrible. When in fact, I didn't. This is like fits in the category of marid ayin, as we usually call it, which is right. We don't want people to start saying bad things about me because they'll misunderstand the situation. This whole question of itself, is this my problem? Do I have to worry about what you're going to say about me? So according to that interpretation, the whole reason I have to do it in front of you is because you knew I took the vow. And if you see me now going against it, you'll suspect me. Therefore, I undo it in front of you. However, we understand this. We're now going to have a question, where do we get this from? It has to be in a person's presence. And we're going to have two stories. One is one we mentioned yesterday about Moshe. So we'll read that right now. Amar Rav Nachman dechtiv. Vayomer Hashem Moshe b'Midyan. God said to Moshe in Midyan, Lech shuv Mitzrayim. Go and return to Egypt. Ki metu kol anashim, because all the people died. I'm going to read this, and then we're going to explain it sort of from the end backwards. Amar lo b'Midyan nadalta, lech v'hatir nidrecha b'Midyan. You took the vow in Midyan, and you have to kind of add the words in front of Yitro, and therefore go and undo your vow in Midyan. Now, why doesn't it say here in front of Yitro? Because the pasuk didn't use the word Yitro. Pasuk used the word Midyan. So he says, go back to Midyan. Now, Moshe was in Midyan. So first of all, right, there's two ways to understand where this drasha comes from. Either, why did God have to mention Midyan in the pasuk? Moshe was already there. Number two option is, why does it say lech shuv? Lech is go, shuv is return. Could have just said return to Egypt. You don't need to say go and return to Egypt. So maybe the go means go to where you did the neder in the first place and undo it. Okay, so now how do we know Moshe took a vow? Now we see it inside what we discussed yesterday. Dichtiv vayoel Moshe, because it said vayoel Moshe l'shevet et Yitro, and ein Allah ela shvuah. Allah means shvuah. How do we know that? Dichtiv, we quote a verse from Yechezkel that says vayaveh oto ba'ala. Vayaveh oto ba'ala means this is talking about the king of Babylonia took the king of Israel into an Allah, made an oath with them. Where did he make an oath? Now, I'll already tell you there's two different ways to read this next sentence, and the connection, you can read it all the same way, but the connection of the next sentence to this sentence is a good question. Okay, is it connected or is it not connected? So I'm going to read the sugya now in two ways. So the first thing we have is minane mile. Where do we get this from? That you have to undo it in the presence of the person you took the vow. Well, going from the back from the end of the sugya to the beginning of the sugya, Moshe took an oath with Yitro. We know that because it said Vayoel Moshe. When he undid the neder, he had to do it. He says, B'Midyan, right? Go B'Midyan. Therefore, God was telling him you have to undo your neder in Midyan in the presence of Yitro. And that's how we get it has to be done in the presence. And to prove that Vayoel is a shvuah, is an oath, which is like a neder here, they're used synonymously. Sometimes they're very different, but here they're used synonymously. We prove it from this verse in Yechezkel. Now we're going to bring a whole bunch of verses to tell a story in Sefer Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles. What's interesting about the story in Chronicles is that it seems to relate to this pasuk, Vayaveh oto ba'ala. Vayaveh oto ba'ala and Yechezkel could be referring to, it's not clear, but it could be referring to Nebuchadnezzar and Tzidkiyahu. And that's what we're going to see right now. So some people say that Vayaveh oto ba'ala is not proof enough yet that it was an oath. And the way to prove that Allah there is an oath is by telling the upcoming story. But the interesting part is the upcoming story also proves the exact same idea, which is a neder can only be done in the presence of the person who you took the vow in front of, the undoing of the neder. So therefore, there's two ways to read it. Either we're now explaining how we know Allah shvuah, that's from this upcoming story we're going to see, and it happens to also prove our point. Or we already proved Allah shvuah by quoting that pasuk in Yechezkel, Vayaveh oto ba'ala, period. End of section. Where do we get it from? From Moshe. The Moshe story ends by proving Allah's shvuah, and that's how we know that Moshe, and then the pasuk about Midyan showed us he had to undo the neder, and he had to undo it in front of Yitro. And now we're having a second proof, which is the following pasukim in Chronicles. Okay, whether you read it this way or that way, it doesn't really make such a difference, but I always like showing when there's two totally different ways to read the connection of the sentences. I find it very interesting. So now we're going to hear the story. So now we have these Psukim in Chronicles, which say, okay, or one Pasuk in Chronicles, really, and then we're going to build a whole story on that, classic of the Midrashic style, right, Agada style. So it says against, right, Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, it's talking about Tzidkiyahu, he was the last king of Israel. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. In what way did he rebel? Because Nebuchadnezzar made Tzidkiyahu take an oath in the name of God. And obviously what must have happened is he went against the oath, and basically we're going to see at the end of our story, they're going to say this was the reason for the destruction of the temple, okay, and the exile. So remember, he was the last of the Judean kings before the temple was destroyed. My Mardute. So how did Tzidkiyahu, we're talking about First Temple times, how did Tzidkiyahu rebel against Nebuchadnezzar? What was the story? He happened to be there one day when Nebuchadnezzar, he was the only one in the room, and he saw Nebuchadnezzar to have a ka'achil arnava chaya. He ate a live rabbit, okay, which is what we call ever min achai, right? It's taking a limb of an animal without killing it, and that's a despicable thing, even in the eyes of Gentiles. It's seen as a despicable thing, and he did this, and Tzidkiyahu happened to see. Amarle, so Nebuchadnezzar saw that Tzidkiyahu saw him, and he said, promise me that you will not tell anybody and you will not say a word about this. So Tzidkiyahu had no choice. So he took an oath. He was pained in his body. Okay, why did they say pained in his body? Interesting, right? What happened was he so much wanted to tell people because, right, he was being oppressed by Nebuchadnezzar, and he realized this is a great way to weaken him. He was a very strong king. If I start telling everybody about him, all the other nations will look down on Nebuchadnezzar and they won't have any respect for him anymore. So it was hard for him to keep this in. So what did he do? What are we allowed to do? Eat shalash fuate. He went to get it undone. Okay, to who does he go? Probably, right, the Sanhedrin. So he goes to the court to get his undone. Va'amal. And then he told people. And then he told exactly what had happened. Well, we all know what happens when you start talking. Everybody knows. So obviously it gets to Nebuchadnezzar. Now you already noticed what's our topic? Undoing the neder in the presence of the person whose neder it was. So now what did he do? He didn't do it in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Shama Nebuchadnezzar the Kamavazimle. Nebuchadnezzar hears that they're humiliating him. Shalach ba'aite Sanhedrin with Tzidkiyahu. He brings the Sanhedrin and he brings Tzidkiyahu before him. Now, why is he bringing the Sanhedrin and not just Tzidkiyahu? So it seems like he wants the Sanhedrin to rule against Tzidkiyahu and say, you did something wrong, right? He basically, it's an interesting thing. He wants to have Tzidkiyahu judged in his own court. So he brings them all in front of him. Amar lahon, chazitun mai ka'avid Tzidkiyahu. He says to the Sanhedrin, did you see what Tzidkiyahu did? Lav hachi ishtaba b'shmei deshmaya deloma galina. Did I not make him take an oath in the name of God that he wouldn't tell anybody? Amarle. So the Sanhedrin, Amrule, the Sanhedrin says to him, Itchalash fuata. He went against his oath. Amar lahon, mitchalanash fuata. He says to them, really? You can do that? And now this is a thing that, sometimes we see in history that it doesn't look good for the Jews that we could just undo our vows, right? It shows that you don't have to be true to your word. And this is a classic sugya of showing the Gentiles' perspective of our undoing neders, right? That, what? You can do that? Like, I thought your word was your word. How can you just undo that? And it's really a troubling thing about this whole idea of Nedarim, right? Again, you have to understand it from the inside. From the inside, our perspective is, well, you shouldn't have done it in the first place. And therefore, we're going to try to get you out of it because we don't like this whole issue of Nedarim. But from an outsider's perspective, this looks pretty bad, right? It shows the whole thing is if you swear to someone, you're taking your word, you're giving them your word, and then you go against your word. Amrulei, they say very simply, yes, this is the way it works in Judaism. You can do this. But Nebuchadnezzar is smarter than them. Amar lehu bifana, afilu shelo bifana. But wait, does it have to be in my presence, or can it be done not in my presence? Amrile bifanav. They said, oh, well, it has to be done in your presence. Uh-oh, that wasn't done here. Amar lahon va'atem ma'avidaton. Now we see why he really brought the Sanhedrin. Because in the end, it wasn't so much, which seems a little weird, right? That the Sanhedrin is going to rule Tzidkiyahu. Why didn't he bring Tzidkiyahu to his own courts? But here, number one, he is able to get Tzidkiyahu trapped in his own laws, right? Forget about Nebuchadnezzar's laws. You didn't even keep your own Jewish laws. And secondly, he's now going to bring the Sanhedrin to court and say, you did something wrong. How did you annul his vow without doing it in my presence? So my time, why didn't you tell Tzidkiyahu, this isn't the way to undo the vow? You're not doing it halachically. Miyad yeshvu la'aret yidmu ziknei bat Zion. And here we quote a pasuk in Eicha, which is all describing the Churban, the destruction. And it says they went to the ground, they were silent, this Kenim of Zion, right? The daughters of Zion. And then basically we have this terrible scene where the Sanhedrin is basically shamed and embarrassed and humiliated by Nebuchadnezzar on their own laws. They didn't even keep their own laws. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, how does he translate that pasuk? Sheshamtu karim mitachtehem. They took their pillows out from under them, right? Whatever they were sitting on, they basically remove them and they fall to the ground. A very powerful story showing, right, kind of the abuse of halacha by the rabbis, and that is what brought their destruction. So one of the things that Rabbanit El Shimoni deals with in Gefet is how could they, it's really what the commentaries deal with, is how could the Sanhedrin really have done something that was against halacha? It's hard to imagine. So some people give an excuse for it that, well, in other words, while it's true they shouldn't have done it, but possibly some say based on this story, b'di'evad, post facto, if it's done, it's actually effective. And then Tzidkiyahu really doesn't have to keep his vow. And that maybe they still shouldn't have done it, but the fact that they did it means it's actually effective. And there's a debate about whether it's effective or not if it's already done. Right? If it's a done deal, could it be effective or is it not effective at all? Again, this story, both the different versions in the beginning of is it bifanav or not bifanav, and all sorts of other issues here are up for debate. What type of neder are we talking about? Is it only a neder that affects the person or not, based on which option the Yerushalmi? Anyway, for a good in-depth analysis of all the issues, you should listen to Gefet. Okay, new Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer. So our last Mishnah had Rabbi Meir and the rabbis debating nolad. Comes Rabbi Meir and he says, well, even if you don't accept nolad, there are some things that are like nolad, but not really like nolad. So we're going to have to see what this is. And basically, and he means that you can actually use it as a petach to undo your vow. Ve'en chachamim modim lo. And the rabbis, though, still don't agree with him, and they're strict. Now, I should point out here that word ve'en, if you notice there's a little letter next to it, is in some versions doesn't appear. And the exact opposite is what comes out here, which is chachamim modim lo. The rabbis actually agree in this case. So there's a huge debate here based on what version of the text you have about whether, and why is it important? Because we generally hold like the rabbi's position. So we have this position that says that these things can be repealed, but the rabbis disagree, and the rabbis agree. And then you end up with the opposite halacha, depending on what version you have. And in fact, the Rishonim are kind of split as to who holds this version and who holds that version. So let's see what nolad and ena nolad is. Ketzad. What's the case? Amal konam shani nose or she'eni nose et plonit. Okay, this is a classic example brought, obviously, in the world of shiduchim and people trying to insist that people marry other people. And in that day, it was very, very common. The guy says they're pushing him to marry some woman. And he says, I take a vow, I will not marry that woman, sha'avihara, because her father is evil. Amrulo, if they say to him, mate, o sha'asat tshuva, the father died, or repented, well, then that's this nolad ve'ena nolad. Okay, so it was something that didn't exist at the time. But now what's the but? It's a little bit tricky, but you'd have to say maybe this was more expected. Remember the way we defined nolad last class? And now you understand why. Nolad last time was, because we have to differentiate between nolad and nolad v'she'ena nolad. So nolad normally means not in existence yet. Well, this is also not in existence yet. So you have to find something that's different. So that was not in existence and was unlikely. This was not in existence, but was more likely. Now, it's a little bit weird, and the Gemara is going to ask, we talked about death, that it's not unlikely. It's unlikely that someone's going to die. And therefore, how could you say that the father's death is something you were anticipating? Because we just said yesterday that it's not something we were really anticipating. So we'll get back to that when we get to the Gemara. I will not enter this house because it's a bad dog or there's a snake there. Notice the terms are different. The dog died, they told him, or the snake was killed. So most people say, that some of the commentaries say, death to the dog, in other words, often snakes get killed by people. They normally get killed before they die, whereas dogs more naturally die rather than get killed by people. So therefore, the dog dies or the nachash was murdered, it was killed. That's also another example. So I say I won't go into this house, I take a vow because of this dog or snake, and then they get killed or die. Again, two different versions. Yes, chachamim modim or ein chachamim modim. Okay, now we're going to start the Gemara. Konam shani, and really this isn't this. It says in parentheses, but it really should be on the first case because we're going to ask that question that I said. What do you mean when he dies? Mate, noladhu. If the father dies, that's a classic case of nolad. So now we're going to say no, not really. Even though we said yesterday that if you say, oh, had I known they were going to die, I never would have said this. But what was the difference? Yesterday's vow didn't mention anything in the vow about the person who died. This one, Amar Rav Huna naaseh ketoleni dro b'davar. Rav Huna says the way we understand, and now we're going to have two different explanations of this case in the Mishna and why Rabbi Meir says, and possibly the rabbis agree with him, that this is okay to use. Because you're basically, it's like you're making a condition. You didn't make a condition. You didn't say, I won't marry this woman until her father dies. But because you said, I won't marry this woman because her father's bad, it's as if you're saying, but if her father isn't bad anymore because he does tshuva or because he's dead and he's not in existence anymore, then it'll be okay. Then I'll marry her. So basically, they view it, Rav Nachman views it as if it's like Rav Huna, as if it's a condition that you made. The Rabbi Yochanan Amal, he understands the case differently. He says, what was the case? The case was the man got up and said, I vow not to marry this woman because her father's evil. And then it turns out he didn't know, but her father was dead. Or her father had repented already and was no longer evil. I won't get into the question, which we're going to deal with in Sanhedrin, which is, how do you know if someone really does tshuva? That's a whole separate, right? Someone told you they repented doesn't necessarily mean they definitely repented. And that's a whole separate question. We'll get to that later. But one of my favorite topics. Anyway, he now says, basically, the case is not what you thought it was. And then, what would you call this? You called this a neder ta'ut. It was basically a neder made under incorrect information, right? Or I won't go into this house because there's a snake there. And the snake wasn't there. The snake was dead already. Okay? I didn't know that when I took the vow. So that's what we call a neder ta'ut, according to Rabbi Yochanan. This was just a mistake. He didn't know, but the fact was it was already that way. Why does he say that? Because if you say it was something in the future, that's nolad. And basically, it wouldn't make any sense. That was our question. If the father dies, that's classic nolad. He doesn't view like Rav Huna did, which is, this is a condition. So now going to Amud Bet, we're now going to knock out Rabbi Yochanan's approach by basically saying, it's a problem here. Mativ Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba now brings a problem from a Mishnah in the next daf, which I just want you to notice is a few Mishnayot later. Okay? It's not like the next Mishnah. Konam she'eni noseh leplonit ke'ura. You take a vow, again, the same thing about a man. They're trying to get him to marry some woman, and he says, I will not marry this woman because she's ugly. And it turns out there were maybe rumors that she was ugly, but she really wasn't ugly. She was beautiful. Okay? Again, maybe that's all a little subjective. We're not going to get into that. Shchora v'harei levana, that she was dark-skinned, and it turned out she was light-skinned. Ktsara v'harei aruka, she was short, and it turned out she was tall. Okay, whatever he says, I'm not going to marry her because of this, and it turned out she was something different. Mutalba, he's permitted to her because it turns out it was wrong. Now that's very similar to what Rabbi Yochanan just said. It's the same idea. He took a neder thinking the reality was X, and the reality was Y. Lo mipnei shekura v'nasetna. It's not because she was ugly and became beautiful. Shchora v'naset levana. She was dark and then became light. Tzara v'naset aruka. She was short and she grew. Ela shaneder ta'ut. No, because he was simply mistaken. He was under false information, right? He took the vow thinking one thing, and it turned out it wasn't true. So, Bishlama Rav Huna de Amar Naaseh ketoleh nidro b'davar. According to Rav Huna, who said that our Mishnah was talking about, you basically made it a condition, a stipulation, and that's why when the stipulation is no longer relevant, right, you can undo the vow very easily. And then a few Mishnayot later, Tana toled nidro b'davar v'Tana nidre ta'ut. Okay, neder ta'ut. So we have basically our Mishnah was talking about the condition, and that Mishnah was talking about neder ta'ut, and that makes sense. Two different Mishnayot with a space of a few Mishnayot, right, with a bunch of Mishnayot in between them. One's talking about one topic, one's talking about the other. But Rabbi Yochanan Damar kfar meit ukfar asat tshuva. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who understood our Mishnah as a neder ta'ut, lama li'lemitnei trezimne neder ta'ut. There's no reason to have our Mishnah talking about neder ta'ut, and then a few Mishnayot later also talking about neder ta'ut. Also, here it has the whole thing about en chachamim mudim, and there it doesn't have that. So it's very strange. It doesn't make any sense, and therefore kasha. And they're left with the question against Rabbi Yochanan. Seems to be that they kind of knock out his approach, that this isn't really the way to understand the Mishnah. Ve'od amar Rabbi Meir. And furthermore, Rabbi Meir says, potchim lo min hakatuv shebatorah, ve'omrim lo, you can do a petach using a verse in the Torah, and you say the following. Okay, I forbade you, let's say, to benefit from me. And then they say to me, Ilu hayita yodea shata over lo tikom v'lo titor. Right? Why did I do this? Because I was taking my revenge against you. I was very angry at you about something. So they say to me, look, didn't you know that you can't take revenge? Or you can't hate your brother in your heart. Or you're supposed to love your friend like yourself. It's all those things. Basically, when I say I will not benefit from you, or you will not benefit from me, right? I'm angry, I'm doing something mean to you, and this goes against explicit psukim in the Torah. Or let's say I said you can't benefit from me, and then you became poor, and I wanted to give you charity, or not that I even wanted to give you charity, but comes the Mishnah and says, there's a pasuk that says your brother has to live with you, which basically means you're obligated to support people who can have trouble surviving on their own. Shehu ani, because now he's poor and you can't help him. Amar, and then if I say, oh, I had no idea, obviously, right, I did, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time, and had I thought about it, I would never have taken the vow. We can undo the vow using that. So now the Gemara says, Amarle, we have one small thing to deal with in this Mishnah about the poverty case. Amarle Rav Huna bar Rav Katina le Rabbanan. So this Rav Huna bar Katina says to the rabbis, Nema, why don't I just say, instead of using that as a petach, I can basically say that's not true. I'm not going against chayachi chaimach. Why? Because I have a different way to do it. I can basically give you charity, even though you're forbidden to benefit from me. How so? Nema called me ani live alai nafil. Anyone who gets poor doesn't fall on me. It's not my responsibility. Whose responsibility is? The community's responsibility, right? And what does that mean? It means the community has a charity fund where they give out the food. Now, I can just give money to the charity fund, and then you're going to be supported by everybody in the community. But you're not being supported personally by me. My money goes there. From that money, they divide it up among all the poor people. And also, once I pass over the money, it's no longer mine. It belongs to the charity fund. So at that point, I can actually give money to the charity fund. I'm not actually going against the Torah by having taken this vow, because I can support you in some other way. Give money to the charity fund, and from there you will get the money, even if you don't get my money necessarily, but that's helping you to get money, because they're not taking it, let's say, for someone else, and they're giving it to you. So now, why can't I just say that, and then I'm not actually going against the pasuk, and then that shouldn't really work as a petach? To which they say a very interesting answer, and it connects with the ideas that I mentioned. Rabbanit Yafi Clymer said yesterday, which is Amarle ani omer kol hanofel eino nofel yad gabay tchila. Anyone who falls to charity doesn't fall to the gabay tzedakah first. Okay, what does that mean? It means that that's your last resort. If you're poor, the first thing you do is you go to your friends and your family and your neighbors, and then eventually you get to the gabay tzedakah. But at the first stage, your neighbors are already obligated to help you. You're already transgressing the if you're my neighbor and I don't help you. And now it becomes a question, right? So does that mean only if you're my neighbor? In other words, first of all, if I vowed from you, probably we have what to do with each other. Usually you get the most angry at the people you have what to do with. But another answer, and this connects with what Rabbanit said yesterday in her Shiur on second thought, which is that I'm obligated to make sure that people don't get to the Tzedakah. Remember we said, why does it say these people are like mate? They're like they're dead. A poor person is like they're dead. Why? Because it's telling me, it's a way of saying it's your responsibility to find them and not allow them to get to that stage. And that it's my responsibility to look around. So my chiyuv of is not once you get to the Tzedakah. It's before that, to prevent you from getting to such a bad state that you have to be funded by the communal tzedakah fund. Okay, the ideal, and it's a very interesting thing about giving charity, the ideal is to help people before they get to that low stage. And we want to help them right before they get to below the poverty line. We want to help them when they're higher than that so that they don't sink down so low. Okay, new Mishna. And last Mishna for today, potchim, and we'll do the Mishna and the Gemara on this, potchim la'adam b'ketubat ishto. You remember we learned in ketubah, those who learned ketubah, and we'll return to a bunch of issues we learned in Masechet Ketubah. That, but if not, I'll help you out. If you say, I vow not to benefit from my wife, okay, a man says, I vow not to benefit from my wife, or a wife to the husband, okay, if they say it in a particular language, like the basic language, and they don't say it in a unique way that could work somehow, which we've discussed, but I'm not going to get back there. But in general, you will not benefit from me, you can't live, because he's obligated to provide for her all sorts of things. So therefore, he has to divorce her. Now, if he does that, he takes a vow, that means he has to divorce her. So what's a good petach for that? You say, had you known that you would have to pay all this money of the ketubah, would you have taken the vow? And he says, oh no, I wasn't thinking about that when I did it. I don't want to pay her all that money. Like, I don't have the money to pay her. I don't want to do that right now. Then he can undo the vow and then be permitted to stay married to her. Okay, now if you, in our modern eyes, you'd say this man is abusive and maybe she doesn't want to be married to this abusive man if he's taking vows against her. But again, I think we have to understand maybe a vow isn't considered the most abusive thing, since it can be undone. And it was maybe in a moment of anger he said something, or you could say that in those days, maybe women preferred to be in that kind of a marriage, even if it wasn't so great because the alternatives were worse. As hard as you can imagine, right? I mean, it's something that people talk about today, that, people stay in abusive marriages, unfortunately, because they're worried about what the alternatives are. And we know now that that's probably worse for them to stay in the marriage. I don't think that they had that perspective in those days. Whether the reality was different or whether the perspective was different, I don't know, but that's clearly that's not concerning them here. Now we're going to hear a story. So here we have a case. Person said, my wife can't benefit from me, and he's now supposed to divorce her. Okay, that's 400 dinarim, which is the same as 400 zuz, which is basically double the amount of an average ketubah. She had a large ketubah, although we already learned that people added tosefet anyway, but normally it's 200 zuz. Rabbi Akiva. So he comes for Rabbi Akiva, he said, look, you have to divorce her, you have to give her the ketubah. Amarlo, Rebbe. He starts to go with his sob story. He says, listen, my father left me 800 zuz. Okay, he died, left 800 zuz over. We were two brothers, so my brother took 400. Now, it seems this guy had absolutely no money in his name other than what he inherited from his father. So he says, Lo daya, she told him vani matayim, why don't I split it with her 50-50? Yeah, I know my ketubah says 400, but all I have is 400. So why don't we split it 50-50? Amar le Rabbi Akiva, afilu ata mocher sa'ar roshcha, ata noten la ketubata. He says very severely, no. She's deserving of her 400 zuz. If you can't afford that, and you want to give away all your stuff, sell your hair, and that's what you have to do. Right? That's like saying if you have to, right? The last thing you're going to sell is things from your body, right? Yeah. If you have to sell your hair, you have to sell your hair. There's nothing to be done. Amarlo, of course, what does the guy respond? I never would have taken the vow had I known this. Perfect. Hitira Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva undoes the vow. Okay, end of story. So again, as the women were a little bit, what about the poor woman in this story? But again, I really think that you have to remember the woman probably preferred to stay married. So it was probably in her best interest. Okay, to which the Gemara says, now they start with questions not having to do with vows, but having to do with this story. There's some problems with this story from things we learned in ketubah. What are metaltalin doing here in the ketubah conversation? His father left him 400 dinarim. That means cash. Now, cash and movable items are not leaned to the ketubah. So that means she doesn't even have rights to those. So he doesn't have to give her that. He could say, I have no land, and land was leaned to her ketubah. Sorry. So Amar Abaye, karka shavesh shvona me'otina. He says, no, the Mishnah wasn't telling you this because that wasn't the point of the Mishnah in the story. The Mishnah wasn't telling you, but it was obviously land in the value of 800 zuz that his father left. To which they say, but wait, that doesn't jive because Hakatane, the story says, Sa'al Rosho. He says, you even have to sell your hair to pay her. Usal Rosho metaltalehu, and your hair is definitely not leaned to her property, to her ketubah. It's not property. To which he says, Hachi Kamar. No, this is what he said about the hair. Afilu atam ocher sa'al roshcha ve'ochel. No, you have to give her the 400 zuz of the property. But if you tell me I have nothing to eat, well, sell your hair and then you'll have food from there. Shmat mina, what can we infer from this story? And we're going to have a debate about this. It's very interesting. It has nothing to do with Nedarim, but it's a very interesting issue. It's more like a dine mamadot issue, we're talking about financial issues. Shmat mina ein misadrim lebal chov. This means if you owe money and that's all you have, and you're going to be left with nothing, too bad. Okay, basically, ein misadrin is we don't arrange for you to have your basic needs. We don't say, oh, only pay back, X minus your living needs. No, X is what you owe, pay X. Doesn't matter what your living needs are. You could be left with nothing because that's what Rabbi Akiva did to this guy and left him with nothing and said, go sell your hair. Amar Rav Nachman bar Rabbi Yitzchak, he says, no, you misunderstood the story. Lomar she'ein mikarin shtar ketubah. Again, it's two different interpretations. He thinks it's being misinterpreted. He says what this is telling you is we don't tear the ketubah. In other words, how does he view this case, this Rav Nachman bar Rabbi Yitzchak? He says the guy has to pay her back the 400 zuz, but not all right now. Pay back 200, 300 now. Leave yourself some money to live on right now. But she gets to keep the ketubah, which means what's always keeping the deed? It means you can still demand the money. So over time, as he makes more money, if he has to sell his hair or sell other property or whatever it is, or starts maybe going out and getting a job, which it seemed like this guy didn't have because all his money was from inheritance, as he makes money, she can then later come back and claim the rest of it. So she has a claim to all of this money, but he doesn't have to pay it right away because yes, misadrim lebal chov, we don't leave somebody without food to eat, right? If you think about pikuach nefesh and all that, right? We don't leave anyone without any food. We leave them with their basic needs. And then, but the person can still collect down the road. So that's an interesting machloket about whether when someone owes money and it's all their life savings, do we force them to give all that money now, or do we give them time in order to pay it back to allow them to actually function and survive? And it's interesting because it a little bit connects back to our tzedakah story in the previous, right? Which is we're actually creating poverty by doing this. So there's a balance to strike there. Wishing everyone a great day. Start a new Mishna tomorrow.